actually. With us, we have Mike Silber from Liquid Telecom, and he will give us the keynote of the day, which is Bridging the African Internet from... Yeah, so welcome.
Thanks, Michuki, and I appreciate the very kind comments about this being the most important keynote of the day. This is who I am. You may very well have come across me in one or more of those contexts. But as you can see, not just from a liquid perspective, where peering and interconnection is extremely important to us, but in some of the things that I do in other facets of my life, peering and interconnection is an absolutely vital part of what I do and how I operate on a daily basis, including, I should say, as part of the ISPA Management Committee, where ISPA, as has been mentioned, in South Africa runs 2 and hopefully very soon 3 exchange points around the country. So what I wanted to cover today was get the commercial pitch out of the way first, tell you a little bit more about Liquid, who we are, what we do, get into some contexts and some of the stats, primarily coming from Analysis Mason, who are here as well speaking, and then get into some of the trends and some of the analysis we're seeing in terms of the development of the African internet, what's happening, what we believe still needs to happen, the different types of operators and their different needs and strategies, some of the challenges and considerations we're facing, our liquid vision of a connected Africa, and then getting onto the question of local content, which was touched on during the last panel discussion and started becoming recognized as the issue that it actually is. So in terms of Liquid, we were founded in 2004. We're part of the Econet group. We were traditionally a satellite and voice operator. We began planning our fiber rollout in 2008. We launched our high-speed fiber linking Zimbabwe to South Africa and the rest of the world in 2010. Zambia, then through to Zimbabwe, and of course then on to the rest of the world, launched in 2011. Currently, we have more than 6,000 kilometers of fiber live and running traffic. We've got a number of further construction projects underway. I think one of the things that we recognize is sometimes working at Liquid, it feels less like you're working at a telco and more like you're working at a construction company. Services we offer include IP transit, national backhaul, international and national MPLS, international high-speed Ethernet, and legacy STM X or SDH connections. We also moved into the retail space, and we acquired Zimbabwe Online in 2012. I have to spell it out as Zimbabwe Online because South Africans get confused when I say we bought Zol in 2012, and they want to know how much we smoked and how high we got. Our Central African Fiber Project, we're looking at providing a very high-capacity optic fiber network using state-of-the-art technology. The project, as planned, is 8,500 kilometer fiber network connecting the major cities and towns in Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC. Well, not all the major towns in the DRC, because then it would be a close to 11,000 kilometer fiber project. But certainly in the southeast of the DRC, linking those to Liquid's POP in South Africa, using the ring mesh and star topologies to ensure security around that network configuration. As I mentioned, mainly a construction project, also provides international connectivity to the rest of the world and connecting from the terrestrial network onto the undersea cables. Our build quality, we started off exclusively on buried ducted fiber at a minimum depth of 1 meter. At the moment, we're now also expanding our network using OPGW on high voltage power lines. We don't believe in just stringing fiber on poles alongside the road. It's, yes, a cheap and nasty solution which can be deployed when required, but not really a long-term solution for the major national networks that we're looking at. Nodes have high availability power systems, next generation SDH and DWDM equipment, high speed on all routes, ring protection, either in place already or being built to ensure that we do have ring protection. I've got to keep repeating this when I travel in Africa, because there are a lot of people who, lacking a single high capacity route, think that that's all that's required. And then pointing out to them that, as Ben mentioned on the previous panel, when you have interconnect increasing by 10 times in a country, and people actually feel they can rely on broadband connections, and they move more significantly onto those broadband connections, instead of having the multiple redundancies of ridiculously slow and high latency VSAT connections, you now have the incredible capacity on a terrestrial cable. If that breaks, suddenly your economy, which previously wouldn't have noticed an outage because it was planned for a VSAT type internet access and outages were expected. And once you're on cable, an outage suddenly has enormous ramifications, and that's when you do need to start building protection into your network. So our network is very much designed around ring protection, backed up with the NOC and field engineering, metro rings in appropriate cities, fiber to the premises in business and residential districts. And it's likely, at the moment, it's still in trial, in commercial trial, but we're rolling out and we've made significant progress on our FTTX rollout in Harare, and it's likely to be released as a full-scale commercial project far ahead of anything that's going on in South Africa right now. So this is a little bit of what our network looks like, showing our IP transit and MPLS backbone. As you can see on that, we have connectivity to a number of exchange points. And those are the circles that have been shown into the map. And I'll go through them in a little more detail on the next slide, but you'll know then what I'm talking about. At Liquid, we like peering. Our backbone runs on AS30844. Peering contact, you see it over there. We supply a major proportion of internet transit into Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Lesotho. Over 300 peers, open peering at Jinx and Links, and selective private peering elsewhere. We've got a very high peering ratio. We also operate on a number of other ASs, and those ASs are primarily peering locally in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Botswana. We're also members of BINX, Zinx, the Zambian Internet Exchange, as well as peering at Jinx as an ISPA member, and at Links, where we're members as well. You would have seen our connectivity map in the handout. This is a slightly updated connectivity map, just to show the darker pink shows network, own network built. The lighter pink shows leased network, leased fibers, and the dotted lines shows network that's under construction. And when I say under construction, it's not under planning, but in most of those cases, it means the guys have already started stringing or digging. At the moment, we have about, well, as at the end of last week, we had 110 kilometers of duct completed in our South African build, and I would hope that by the end of this week, we would add another 10 to 20 kilometers to that, depending on how the guys manage to get along this week. But a little bit of context, having given you the sales pitch, a little bit of context as to how we got here. So this is African connectivity or African international connectivity in 2001, excluding satellite, but we're talking about high-speed non-satellite capacity. That's what it looked like in 2001. And strangely enough, that's what it looked like in 2002, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, and 7, and 8. And then suddenly in 2009, we started seeing a massive change. Our friends and colleagues at Telecom and teams started introducing some real difference into the continental picture. And 2010 saw even further changes. And yes, we're showing our little network. There were other terrestrial builds. And 2011, WAX came in. And 2012, ACE should come in. In 2013, SAX, which means that we've seen from 2001 with SAT3 sitting at 340 gig, massive increases in capacity as those other cable systems have come on board. So capacity has more than doubled, well, quite significantly increased in 2009, and 2010 saw another significant jump. And 2011 saw an even further significant jump. And 2012 and 2013, each of these significant magnitudes of growth over what had previously existed. And those significant jumps are going to see significant changes in the market, and we don't think that we've seen the full impact of those capacity jumps actually having filtered into the market. Part of the reason is because of the difference in cost between satellite and cable. So on the left is the breakdown of broadband costs using satellite. So your international connectivity is about 54%, last mile 34%, middle mile, national backhaul, other costs sitting in single digits. When you get to cable costs, last mile becomes 61% of your cost. And the others sitting international is then 13%, middle mile 10%, and the others in the single digits. Now that's really significant. Compared to that 34% for satellite, you're now looking at 61%. Now, that's really a huge change, especially given that not much of Africa has the existing copper infrastructure to fully utilize DSL technologies. You know, it's one thing in Europe when you have telco incumbents who have built significant copper networks over the years. But in Africa, where either copper networks weren't built or have degraded, or in some places like South Africa where the copper's been stolen. I know places like Zambia and the DRC, it's not worth it. You know, it's easier to dig it out of the ground than it is to steal it from networks. But for many of us where we don't have such copper edges, it is actually lucrative for people to take copper cables and to sell them to third parties who will melt them down and push them back into the economy. Comparing operators and technologies, we're looking there at, again, the costs involved in providing connectivity. And we're seeing that niche wireless is incredibly expensive, and a very significant part of that is the last mile. Wireline technologies start getting significantly cheaper, and that last mile, though, is still a very significant contributor. And then the reason why GSM has been so incredibly popular, pervasive, and why it's grown so rapidly in Africa is in that last graph, because those costs are so low when you're getting onto the mass market wireless. It's the reason why GSM has led to such significant changes in African communications over the last 10 years. The current market is almost unrecognizable thanks to the GSM operators and the innovation they've brought, the ability they've brought to everyday Africans who previously didn't have access to a fixed line device. Now they have access through a mobile device, but more than that, that mobile device can do more than just voice. And this was touched on by Telecom in their presentation yesterday. But in the UK at the moment, data usage is currently residential fixed broadband taking up the most significant proportion, while mobile broadband is an interesting but rather insignificant portion of the UK data usage. Those figures in Africa are obviously going to look very differently. The effective penetration on cost per subscriber. So obviously the difference between wireless, wireline, high penetration and low penetration, you're going to see very significant cost changes. And also what we're seeing is a significant drop in the cost or an increase in the affordability of broadband. But at some stage, that's going to start leveling off. And that's based on this analysis going to start happening from 2011, 2012. It should reach a more or less flat line in terms of the price decreases, with some slight decreases coming through beyond that. And again, still the most significant contributor to the cost there being the last mile costs. What that means in terms of monthly broadband prices across Africa, and if you see there you've got it from 2007 through to 2011, is the prices above $1,000 are in pink up at the top of those charts. And at one stage in 2008, you actually saw an increase in the number of users for those above $1,000 broadband packages because people were realizing the benefits of broadband connectivity and were willing to pay that. But we're starting to see very few of those, or the number of those decreasing, simply as broadband becomes more affordable. And we're starting to see a significant increase in the cheaper broadband packages, and hopefully meaning that you're going to start seeing a lot more people having access and being able to access affordable broadband across Africa. So what do we see that's been happening in development of the African internet? In 2002, satellite trunk routes, undersea fibers available, but often priced similarly or even more expensive than satellite. Internet hubbing in Europe or North America. Very few cross-border connections, very few. Some countries with a local exchange point. Internet was expensive, and internet had extremely high latency. African internet in 2012, mostly subsea trunk routes, multiple subsea routes and competition leading to lower pricing. Internet hubbing is now mostly in Europe. It seems the exchange points of choice for Africa is links. We asked for a count, and I think there were 13 African operators who are links members, and a number of others who are connecting through links members into links. Some cross-border connections, mostly selling commercial transit to countries with no landing stations. Nearly all of the countries have a local exchange point. Many of these have participation from the local incumbent. Certainly, internet is cheaper than before. Latency to Europe is about 50% of what it was before. And unfortunately, inter-African latency is still about the same as direct satellite. So What are we hoping we're going to see in an African internet in 10 years from now? What we would like to see, what we might see, is a fully meshed terrestrial internet. Maybe what we'll even see is less direct connections to subsea cables as they become less important through this mesh network. Cross-border peering becomes a real reality, but we're not really sure who's going to be doing the cross-border peering. We don't expect to see a Pan-African exchange point, and I think the lessons from Europe are clear on that one. We may get some regional centers developing, but we don't expect to see a Pan-African exchange point. One of the questions we do have is whether the African internet backbone will be owned by African operators or whether a traditional tier 1 US-based carrier will snap it up from the African innovators who build that network. And one of the questions we have is whether there will be enough content and traffic to support that meshed network. How did we get here? Certainly the subsea cables. Competition has been important. Not necessarily only capacity, but also competition has brought rapid drop in prices. We suspect that the supply of subsea capacity has now probably exceeded current demand. Now, we all know what current demand looks like. It's current. It's very possible that next week or next month, current demand will look like a very small speck compared to then current demand. But for what's in demand right now, we suspect that the subsea capacities are adequate, and certainly with the upgrade potential on those systems, they should be more than adequate. Terrestrial fiber networks are being built. Unfortunately, digging takes longer than laying fiber on the seabed. And you should have had the idea from yesterday's discussion, but crossing borders can sometimes take almost as long or possibly even longer than negotiating an international subsea consortium. Cross-border capacity is primarily used for commercial IP transit from countries with landing stations to landlocked countries, as well as to voice and corporate data networks. What we believe needs to happen is investment in high-speed last mile. We saw in those previous graphs, at the moment, last mile is the highest cost contributor and the biggest barrier to adoption of broadband in Africa. GSM phones are wonderful, but they really are not, in the most cases, high-speed broadband devices. We really believe that FTTX, WiMAX, LTE, DSL type products need to happen for the African internet to really grow. In those countries where the incumbent has a network, local loop unbundling would be really nice. You know, in South Africa, we keep being promised local loop unbundling, and it just keeps being delayed further. Services based around high-speed content will also drive growth in bandwidth being used by subscribers. That's certainly the direction we see it going. More investment in terrestrial trunk routes, national backhaul, cross-border will grow as the business cases develop, and to some extent those business cases are driven by the previous factors I mentioned. GSM networks, not the internet, will remain the main drivers of investment in national backhaul. 3G has the capability to deliver to millions of subscribers. They're not always at broadband speeds or at the most reliable speeds, but it certainly starts giving people the taste of broadband, which hopefully will just increase their appetites. Increased internet subscribers multiplied by more bandwidth per subscriber will make the cost per megabit per second less expensive and drive subscriber growth. What we've been seeing is that different people have different strategies, and the main differentiators we've seen has been between incumbent telcos or PTOs, the mobile operators or Pan-African networks as part of a larger group, the independent mobiles or independent entrepreneurial ISPs, and we believe we have a different approach from all three of those. From the national incumbents, often they own significant national copper and fiber networks, sometimes, but not always, dominant supplier of internet nationally. They have a license and permission to run most types of telco service, if not all types of telco service in the country. Almost certainly would have made a significant investment in a subsea consortium, whether it's using that capacity or not. And it's surprising the number of people who are not using their capacity. May own and have exclusivity on a landing station. May have connection to borders where it interconnects to similar entities in neighboring countries. Its network almost always stops at its own border. Cross-border connections might be used for voice, IPLC half circuits, OSS, maybe to sell internet transit or to buy internet transit from its neighbor. Problems with connections for those operators are a lack of SLA. Different networks, so probably no actual protection. In order to get protection, you actually need to buy 2 links to have any sort of quality of service guarantees. The Pan-African networks, and I try to keep the sizes of those network pictures more or less the same so that nobody got offended. You know, it wasn't intended in any way as an indication of their size in the market or in any other way. We're seeing mobile groups. We're seeing UbuntuNet as an academic network. We're seeing ISPs who've grown across the continent. The group as a whole will have sizable bandwidth needs and a national network in a number of countries. Those countries are not necessarily contiguous. They don't necessarily border with each other. They've been chosen on commercial grounds. They've been chosen on the basis of where licensing was possible or easy or simply where the operator won the bid. Those networks will have made substantial investments in subsea capacity at a group level. And the desire is to link up those networks to the Pan-African network, aggregating and hubbing the purchased subsea capacity at strategic landing or interconnect points. The independent ISP or mobile, usually entrepreneurial, we're generally seeing bandwidth needs below STM1 level. Often they're unable to make commitments in jumps of STM1. There's still a lot of small entrepreneurial operators out there. They need resilience. Not always possible to survive if single-homed on one fiber system. They generally buy IP transit, but they do peer locally. They're more focused on last-mile customer acquisition rather than on long-distance projects. And they may have business customers needing international private VPNs. Where we see ourselves as different is we see ourselves building one network across multiple bordering countries. We hold a license in all of those countries. We want to cross borders. As much as the pain and inconvenience that it sometimes causes, we want to cross borders. We believe that's what differentiates us. We're open to joint ventures and partnerships. We recognize those areas, those countries, those particular areas of skill and expertise that we have. We also recognize where we don't have strength in a country or particular skill or expertise in a particular area. We regard ourselves as a carrier's carrier, servicing the needs of all different types of operators, all of those 3 that I've mentioned. And we offer a diverse range of products to support enterprise, home user, rural broadband. We're not only focused on corporate networks. Where the challenges are going to come in terms of growing that vision of the 2022 African Internet, regulatory conditions need to allow growth. My personal attitude is the best regulation is the lightest touch regulation, but we do understand that sometimes regulatory intervention is required. Sometimes it's extremely welcomed. For example, with regards to local loop unbundling. You know, we welcome interventionist regulators if they're going to intervene to actually assist operators, not just to assist an incumbent or a particular policy or rule in country. We see significant challenges in coordination with other government departments, where connecting to a university, but because we're on the other side of the road and we can't get Department of Roads permission to cross under the road, the connectivity gets delayed by almost a year. You know, the left hand not talking to the right hand leads to significant delays, challenges, inconvenience. We see a lack of understanding in various departments across government, and it may be national, provincial, or local government, roads, power, ICT policy people, customs and excise. Those people are not necessarily coordinated and brought in to create a national approach to building networks. So you have permissions, but you struggle to bring your equipment in. Or you can bring your equipment in, but when you want to move it on to the next country to continue your build over there, when you're talking about construction equipment, suddenly you're hit by customs and excise issues. Coordination between countries is a significant challenge. Sometimes the lack of coordination works in your favor because you can just simply proceed. But sometimes that lack of coordination results in massive holdups as the countries have different approaches, requirements, views on the cross-border connection. Political instability, and it was mentioned before, is certainly a challenge. We recognize that at times we're going through areas that are significantly unstable, but all systems go through those. Machuki touched on it when he was talking about the redundancy into Kenya. Going through troubled areas is just a reality of building a Pan-African internet. Construction projects, of course, bring about their own challenges. Cross-border peering will be low capacity in many cases. And if you're looking at low capacity, multiple E1s are incredibly expensive to do. You know, it gets really expensive when you're peering at that very low capacity level. And then lastly, you do land up with unique African challenges. We had one of those just over a month ago where we had a fiber break. And when the team arrived to investigate, they found elephant footprints and a herd had crossed over. And because of some quality issues on that particular section of build, we actually had a break caused by elephant traffic. Now, those are unique challenges. I promise you, no Asian or European manufacturer has developed ducting or fiber that has been tested to withstand African elephant traffic. So those are unique challenges that we welcome. I'm sure the others in this room welcome as well, because that's why we are in Africa and why we operate in Africa. The result, in our view, the internet won't develop to a plan. Different operators will follow their own strategies, and that should be welcomed. You can't force people into a strategic straitjacket and force everybody to go the same route. And the truth of the matter is different strategies will work in different countries for different operators because of their unique character. The African internet will evolve as operators execute their strategies, some well, some not so well. It'll end up being a lot more affordable to most users. Most citizens and all businesses will be users of the African internet, and we do believe it'll look something like that fully meshed network that I mentioned earlier. We really believe that those connections will be built, that level of mesh will develop over time. One of the issues, though, that's going to either lead to that being developed or not being developed is the question of local content. We see 5% of total traffic in and out of Lesotho, Zambia, and Zimbabwe is for South Africa. Mostly South African news and television, internet banking, email, and e-commerce. Hardly any traffic between the other neighbors. Close to zero between, for example, Zimbabwe and Zambia or Zambia and Botswana. So South Africa has at least some local content or regional content coming out of it, but almost no other regional exchange of content. Compare that to international voice. So if you compared international voice traffic between Zambia and Botswana or Zimbabwe and Botswana, there's a lot of international voice traffic. But on the data side, almost nothing. We also find that Pan-African interest sites like Big Brother Africa, news sites, are usually hosted out of the US or Europe. We did a little bit of analysis and we pulled the top 25 websites in Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire to see if they were hosted locally. We also compared that to more developed internet nations. South Africa has 6 of the top 25 sites that are actually hosted locally. All the others are hosted offshore, and yes, some of those are sites like Google. Some of those are sites like BBC or CNN. A couple of those are very localized sites, but are being hosted on international CDNs to ensure speed of delivery. Of the 25, as I said, South Africa has 6, France has 10, Brazil has 7. Of the Ivory Coast, 2 are hosted locally. Egypt has 3. The others don't have any. That to us is clearly indicative that there is an issue with local content and local hosting. It's also worth noting that none of these are particularly content-heavy sites. Also that Nigeria is creating the most video content of any African nation. When you look at the top 25 in countries like the US, Russia, and China, it's almost exclusively local hosted. So what's the answer? There's a significant gap in the market. Potentially very valuable African websites and applications have yet to be created. In our view, that's what's going to drive the African internet as people move beyond US and European content and actually move towards local content. Someone will be creating that content. It could very well be somebody in this room. And a comment that was made by Ben, our CTO, and I thought it's very worth sharing, is that Mark Zuckerberg is 28 years old. And in May this year, he lost $2 billion. Wouldn't you like to be 28 and be able to lose $2 billion? At which point, I suppose I should stop sharing my vision and maybe get some comments, questions, responses from the audience. Chiki, I don't know if you want to take that over or if you want me to continue.
I will help you up there.
Thank you. I'll stand.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll open up for questions. So see, we already have mics. Okay. You can't hear? Okay. All right. Good.
Mike, quick question. You mentioned only 5% traffic coming from South Africa. Typically for South African users, I'm seeing up to 50% traffic coming from locals. Do you think that's because they're not interested in South African content, or I'm just intrigued. Because of the CDNs that have been deployed in South Africa, I'm surprised that that's such a low volume.
Because of the peering issues that we have, we tend to pull most CDN content through from Europe. We don't actually pull it from South Africa. At the moment, it's just cheaper to pull it through from Europe. What for us was very instructive is that it's 5% versus 0. At least South Africa has some content which is of interest to its neighbors. But it seems that nobody has content which is of interest to each other. And Winston, I see you kind of nodding and shaking your head at the same time. Possibly you're one of the few exceptions as somebody who's traveled a bit more around in that region. But I suspect for most people, there's no real crossover interest.
This is more of a bit of a statement as well as a question. I guess it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but this is why we're here. We've had a bit of experience with ISPs in Congo. When we designed the ISP for them up there, the idea was to have web servers up there, get the guys to register domains, get local email. And while unfortunately, we weren't really involved in the running of the ISP, but there's a very big thing against local content. I think we need to get a big mindset. There needs to be a mindset change with other African countries to actually see the benefits of hosting mail locally, hosting a domain name. And I guess it's all got to do with content, got to do with interconnectivity. You've got to have a reliable DNS servers, reliable mail servers, reliable infrastructure. But there's got to be a very big mind shift, and I don't know how, or the role players that need to get involved to force that mind shift and encourage that mind shift to have that local content. Because until there is that local content, as you've shown here, it's never going to, that mindset won't shift.
I agree completely, and I'm very glad that somebody else is making statements because it's not only up to me. Yeah, the DRC is a perfect example. At least the administration has moved to become more local, but still, name servers are not all local, and a significant amount of the administration is still run from outside the country, and I don't actually see the CCTLD administrator was here earlier. He'll happily tell you about the challenges they face. It's actually quite funny sometimes meeting senior government officials who either have a yahoo.fr email address or will have a .cd email address, which they will then cross out and they will write their yahoo.fr email address on their business card before giving it to you because their locally hosted email doesn't work.
Mike, regarding your comment about your view of what the regulator's role should be and your preference to sort of a light touch regulation, given your experience with Liquid and the fact that you are a legal mind, could you comment about what you would infer from the behavior of the regulators in the markets that you have experience in, what actually their driver is, what their objective is? Are they, in general, there to benefit the economies or benefit, the markets, or are they there to protect the incumbents, etc.?
It's a very, very interesting question. Hopefully not too esoteric for others in the room. As for a legal mind, I'd say more like a legal quagmire, but that's a different issue. Most regulators that I meet, I tend to find are extremely confused because they see their role as a multifaceted one, protecting local players from rapacious external parties. They see their role as protecting consumers, which generally happens by lowering prices and improving service levels and service standards. Connectivity in the data space, certainly bandwidth availability, speeds, latency. They also do often have a revenue generation function, whether it's to support their own operations or from a state perspective, they're expected to raise certain revenues through license fees, as well as some very important local requirements like protecting local jobs, protecting incumbents, not because they're bad protectionists, but because they're concerned about the potential impact on local players, local operators, local employees, local safety and security, local stability. My general comment is those are all, except of course for raising money, which I don't believe is a noble endeavor, but it's a necessary one. All of the other competing prerogatives that regulators have are absolutely understandable. Generally, my biggest approach to regulators, I think others would agree, is to try and say, don't be afraid of us. We're not actually here as neo-colonialists to come and damage your country or to extract as much from your country, leaving it bereft and barren. In fact, the more we can build your economy, the more we can help bring commerce to your country, the more we can facilitate communication. It's been shown through a number of empiric studies, the more growth there will be. Bandwidth in most cases equals further growth. Allow us to bring more bandwidth, you should see growth accelerating. Starve your country of bandwidth as you're doing at the moment, and you're going to see your economy stagnating as they are at the moment. And yes, from time to time there will be financial and bandwidth flows. At the moment, as we're seeing, most of those bandwidth flows are external as people are devouring external content, European, North American content. But if a liberalization is accompanied with initiatives to actually drive local content, and I don't mean protectionist initiatives to stop or to force local content, but rather to encourage local content creators by giving them and enabling a freer environment rather than a more restrictive environment. That should then start turning that bandwidth deficit or that bandwidth anomaly around, and we should see more bandwidth remaining locally. We should see more content locally. We should see economies growing. And a lot of regulators don't understand the internet space. They're used to very traditional telco models and trying to say, don't be afraid. It'll level out in the end, and the more freedom will translate into more benefits is something that's anomalous to them. They're used to seeing more freedom leading to voice over IP operators who taking traffic off traditional voice operators, and they're seeing decreases in revenue. You know, for them, VoIP is a bad thing. Go to the citizens and they say it's a great thing. It costs a lot less for expats to phone me or for me to phone my family overseas. Why is it a bad thing? It's a great thing. More of it. It makes us happier. It allows us to communicate more freely, and we want more bandwidth. Yes, operators' revenues are dropping right now because of VoIP. But as people say, well, in order to use VoIP properly, I need more bandwidth. I need broadband in order to run Skype or whatever it may be. It's good. Those operators are going to see their revenues increase in due course. It's a balancing act. This is not a situation where there's a big ditch and you're going to get stuck into it that the internet has created. More access will eventually level itself out. And that's the biggest challenge to me in dealing with regulators, is getting them to firstly see that, and then secondly giving them the comfort to embark on a very strange and quite dangerous journey, because it's completely different from what they're used to, which is putting in restrictions and controls to try and achieve something rather than opening up in order to achieve the same objectives.
I see your comments drawing a reaction from the regulator, so
I'd
yes.
be very interested in hearing those.
Yes, thank you. Well, first I have a question, but I have a comment as well. From what I gathered in your last interaction, I would like to state a fact that regulation itself has evolved beyond protecting the incumbent operator. It's a fact, and it's just a matter of the complication is brought about by governments which do not want to let go of their percentage shareholding in such incumbents. That is my statement. Now to the question. In your slide where you talked about telcos, you had a point that almost certainly you have telcos who have made significant investment in undersea cables. And there was a proviso there that whether they utilize it or not. Now, in my experience, and maybe most of us know that we have telcos who have such significant investment. And in fact, we know that some telcos have invested in 2 or more undersea cables, yet they are not utilizing that bandwidth in their countries. Now, in your opinion, why do you think this is so? And do you not think, now, I'm not trying to influence your answer to that first question, but do you not think that some form of regulatory intervention is needed in such cases? Because here you have telcos who are, to put it bluntly, hogging this capacity bandwidth. Thank you.
Thank you for the intervention. And firstly, with regard to your first statement, I agree with you completely. I think many regulators in the region are not simply protecting incumbents. Unfortunately, though, there is a lack of unanimity amongst African regulators. And it's a pleasure dealing with some and less of a pleasure dealing with others, because if you go and look, for example, at discussions held at regional associations like CRASA, there may seem to be unanimity. When it comes to actual in-country implementation, the reality is unfortunately quite different, and individual local nuances will have very significantly different impacts based on interpretations in country. With regard to your second comment, or your main question, I would have thought that the cost of capital invested by those telcos would be enough of an incentive for them to actually use their capacity. I can't understand that a regulatory threat would provide even more incentive to do that, because they're already losing money. In very few cases do I think that's an initiative to actually exclude third parties from access to the cable. There might be 1 or 2 of those, in which case most countries' regulatory regimes do have a sufficiently robust anti-competitive or structures in order to regulate anti-competitive action. Not necessarily in the telco space, but certainly in the general business sphere. The competition legislation would allow action if the purchase of capacity on an undersea cable was designed to exclude third parties. We're seeing more often a situation where parties don't know what to do with that bandwidth, how to bring it into important population areas, how to sell it to people, how to best utilize it. And so it goes largely unused, sitting at landing stations, not being brought into major cities, not being rolled out because there's a lack of last mile. And I think that was the point that I was trying to make, far more than the fact that operators need to now be incentivized, whether it's a carrot or a stick incentive to make use of that, but rather how do you actually get that capacity from the landing station into your main population centers and through the last mile connections to the individual users, how do you get users who don't have electricity to buy computers and with which to consume broadband? You know, this is one of those realities of Africa, is we need significant investment in a number of infrastructure areas. It's not only in the telco space that we're going to see change, but we also need to see reliable power. We also need people with the buying power to purchase devices with which to consume broadband products. And there seems to have been a rush to buy undersea cable capacity for the future, but without always recognizing that break even on that is going to take a very long time, because populations are not necessarily in a position right now to start making use of even a small fraction of that capacity.
Professor Kashoda? Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, Irish Depri from Nigeria, develop integrated services. I want to ask a question. Like my business is a small business, and what are the required tools where I want to play the game of peering? What is expected of me to have before I can join the big league of peering? It is not to you, Dr. Peering. I don't know if you're here. You can help me with that. Or any other person can, you know.
My attitude and the Liquid attitude is everybody in a peering arrangement, in a peering relationship, adds value. So we have a very open peering policy. I'm not going to claim that we will allow anybody to do anything anywhere in any of our data centers or POPs, but we have a very open peering policy because we believe that every small network adds benefit to the larger network. Don't try tricks. You know, if you want transit by transit, don't try and steal free transit through a peering relationship. But that's also up to us to manage. You know, it's not just putting rules and restrictions in place to exclude smaller parties. It's also making sure that technically we've got our peering set up correctly so that guys aren't stealing free transit. Other than that, my attitude is peering adds value to both parties. Doesn't matter what the difference in size is. If you've got eyeballs or if you have content, you add value to that relationship, and it must be mutually beneficial. How to convince other operators of the same is one of the biggest challenges we've had. Even some of the most progressive operators across Africa, challengers, people who 10 years ago were litigating for some of the openness that we all want in a more competitive telco environment in Africa, are now, because they've managed to reach a particular size and scale, setting exclusions in terms of their peering policies because they don't want third parties to piggyback on the gains they've managed to obtain through a lot of effort and hard work. Our attitude is different, which is the more people who piggyback on us, the more people we can charge for the lift. So you're most welcome. Come on board.
Thank you.
I want to ask you the question that probably follows up the issue of regulatory intervention on an operator that is holding international capacity but not selling it to anyone, and just come inside not the international, but inside the country. Do you think there should be a regulatory intervention in terms of circuits, leased line circuits, pricing? Because what we are finding is that a lot of operators are holding a lot of capacity, even probably including your capacity from Johannesburg up to Zambia, but they will not sell it in an open manner. They will give one price to those they are associated with in business and another price to those they think are their competitors. Is there a point at which we should be encouraging openness and fairness in pricing of leased lines? through some regulatory intervention?
You know, I think there's too much reliance in the telco space on telco-specific regulation. And I speak from a South African perspective on this because I know the South African competition environment far better than I do in other countries. But there has been an interesting game of volleyball that's been played over the years by the incumbent and by others, bouncing questions of competition and regulation between the competition regulator and the telco regulator, the telecoms regulator. And that's been a very successful way of ensuring that the issues don't get raised, because you can spend 5 or 6 years just fighting about which is the right forum in which to address a matter, during which time you continue with your allegedly anti-competitive practices. My view, in whichever country it may be, the most important thing is certainty. If the telecoms regulator has the capacity and the expertise to deal with competition matters, then by all means it should do so. I tend to find in most countries, even in the most well-resourced regulators, they lack specific competition law expertise or pro-competitive regulatory expertise, and their interventions are generally reactive rather than proactive. The proposal in South Africa is that the regulator should be responsible for pro-competitive regulation, so proactive regulation designed to increase competition, while the competition regulator should deal with punishing and enforcing those operators who are operating in an anti-competitive manner. That is an interesting divide, and one which certainly it sounds good in theory. In practice, it hasn't seen much in the way of development in South Africa. Maybe somebody will get it better in a different country. What I can say is that anti-competitive behavior, in our opinion, is unacceptable. There are, and in multiple jurisdictions, they've defined situations where you can discriminate on pricing, whether it's volume. You know, obviously you're going to give a better price to somebody who's buying 10 times the bandwidth as a different customer. Payment terms, creditworthiness. All of these are perfectly acceptable conditions. The term of the contract. Is somebody buying an IRU or month by month? Are they willing to commit for 5 years or only 12 months? All of these are factors that need to be taken into account when purchasing bandwidth or motor vehicles or eggs and flour. And you are entitled quite legitimately to consider those factors when setting prices. At the same time, I do agree with you. There are some operators who hold very tightly onto their national circuits, never mind their international circuits, and squeeze those as tightly as possible to create a very inflated environment. What we're seeing is the more you open, the more money you make. Yeah, we don't believe in throwing open all of our capacity right now, but that's simply because we haven't put all of the equipment to light every one of our fibers to the maximum right now, because that would have been extremely expensive for a market which has already, as Ben's mentioned, increased tenfold in just over a year. In due course, we will start upgrading equipment. We will start lighting additional fibers as that capacity requirement increases, and we will open more and more capacity. But other than that technical and CapEx restriction, we see this as a situation, what I call a field of dreams situation. If you build it, they will come. And the more we sell, the more people want, so we sell more. And it's not a situation where we really need to regulate availability so much so that we can keep prices high, because people just keep wanting more and more. And so we keep making more capacity available. But you're right, there's some operators who don't do that, and those are the times where some intervention is appropriate. And in most countries, there is a competition law which would allow the competition regulator to intervene. It doesn't necessarily mean that the telecoms regulator has to get involved. Possibly, as I said, with proactive regulation, prohibiting that sort of practice. But if somebody's actually doing it on a day-to-day basis, let the telecoms regulators get on with telecoms issues and refer that to the competition regulator and let them run the 4 or 5 year investigation into anti-competitive practices and engaging lots of economists and lawyers in a very lengthy process, to find if somebody has been doing something which is anti-competitive and if there's an appropriate sanction that should be imposed on them.
And what do you think about the proper action from your regulator regarding significant market power operators, like incumbent? Should it regulate its prices for interconnection, for example, or leave it for market, for significant market power operators?
Significant market power is a really interesting question in an increasingly competitive market. And especially as a new entrant, it's very interesting to us because we're not an incumbent in any of these markets. But we have, and you've seen in the presentation, in a number of countries, we're already starting to see ourselves becoming a dominant provider of data services into those countries, and certainly on the international data side. It's an area that we're extremely concerned about. We would prefer not to be over-regulated. At the same time, we understand that regulation is appropriate once somebody gets into a dominant position. We have some questions about any declaration of dominance when you're such a new entrant, when you're taking on incumbents who've been there for years, and they haven't made good on the capacity that they've actually had to supply services to the market. They've maintained their dominance by strangling the market. But if it means that we're declared dominant in a market, that we have a significant market power declaration in a country made, we'll take that as a huge accomplishment. We will take that as a significant pat on the back, and instead of complaining about it, we're likely to greatly appreciate the compliment being paid to us. And we'll happily work within whatever restrictions are imposed or that might be regarded as necessary within that market, because they are necessary. They're generally necessary, and in most markets, the entity with significant market power is the entity that's been there for 30, 40, 50 years, that's entrenched itself by building infrastructure. We've entrenched ourselves in some markets simply by being willing to build where nobody else has, by willing to take chances and roll out services and open up services that others thought were not viable in those markets. And if it leads to a situation where we have significant market power, we'll take the restrictions that's imposed because they're appropriate.
Any other questions? Okay, I definitely have one. So in one of your slides, you had the picture of Africa, or rather the image of Africa in 2022. And we have been thinking about this, and if you notice at the back of your T-shirt, what we've said is, 80% local traffic in Africa and 20% by 2020. Do you think this is a realistic ambition, or are we being too ambitious?
I suppose it depends on whether you include CDNs and CDN nodes hosted in Africa or not. If you're going to include CDN nodes in Africa, then yes, absolutely, it's achievable, it's laudable, and I think it's something worth fighting towards. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in terms of actual creation of local content, if we don't consider CDN nodes, I don't think it's achievable, because there just isn't enough African content to make up 80% of content being consumed in Africa by 2020. Well, certainly today, there's not enough African content to make up 80% of the content consumed in Africa today. And unless there's a radical change, which we're not seeing in the growth of local content, there won't be enough content in 2020. That's one of the things we're hoping, and we're not in the content creation business. We're hoping desperately that content creators will come because we would love to carry their traffic for them.
There's a question at the back. Mike, please.
And of course, in that answer, I was excluding foreign-originated spam.
Eddie from Rwanda. About what you've just said, you previously said that you don't want to serve, I think, the non-South African market from the CDN in Johannesburg because it was more costly for you to do it here, but you serve them from the CDN in Europe. Did I get it right?
It's not a question of we don't want to. Mm-hmm. It's what the current CDN hosts, or the hosts of CDN nodes in South Africa will charge for transit as compared to what we're paying for transit in Europe and the cost of bringing that traffic through. At the moment, the sums just don't make sense for us to take content from CDN nodes in South Africa. In due course, we're hoping that the markets in territories like Zimbabwe, Zambia, and the other countries in which we operate are going to be of a suitable size to allow us to host nodes, or third parties, competitors, customers of ours will be hosting CDN nodes in those territories. But right now, those markets aren't big enough to attract the CDN providers out there. So at the moment, CDN type traffic is largely served either in South Africa, and if you buy transit in South Africa, you'll get access to it, or will get served out of Europe. So it's not a case of we don't want to. We'd be more than happy to. Just right now, it doesn't make economic sense. We believe that most of the South African operators have just got their sums wrong.
You don't seem happy with the answer. Mike? Mike?
I mean, the way I'm actually going to do a plug for our session after lunch where we talk about content and regional content, and we'll go into this in much more detail. That's what I was going to say. But Eddie, what do you think?
I didn't hear. Okay, so yes, definitely the issue will be discussed extensively after the lunch break in one of the panels with respect to content. So I think I'd like to close the questions at this point. Mike will be around, I believe, and so you can definitely approach him if you have any more questions directly to him. And at this time, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank him for the excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and if I could ask, just as one very simple lawyer, if you do have technical questions, the best person and the person who helped significantly in putting the presentation together is Ben Roberts, who was on the previous panel. So please, instead of embarrassing me, you can address the technical questions to Ben, because he's going to be in a better position to answer those.
We'll do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that comes to an end, the keynote presentation, which was the most important presentation for today. And I am happy because it lines us up to the next sessions as well for the afternoon, which will be talking about content and growing regional internet exchange, national exchange points into regional internet exchange points, which is of interest. At this point, I'll be happy to send you out to lunch, but before you go for lunch, we have one small activity that we need to do. The activity is we need to go and take a picture, a group picture, or a group photo, which is going to be taken at the staircase to the foyer, right behind the the lifts or the elevators, so we can assemble there. The photographer has already gone, so from here we go take the picture, photograph, and then go for lunch. Second and most importantly is that after lunch, or rather the first session, before we start the first panel, we will do a raffle. And for those of you who have completed the Urban Networks questionnaire, there will be an opportunity to win an iPad. So if you filled it up, come back after lunch and you'll have the chance to win an iPad, hoping that you're the lucky winner of the draw. So with that, please proceed. Follow Howie, who is here. He will show you where the photograph will be taken. Thank you very much.